The 2008 crisis led to the too-big-to-fail theory being advanced in defense of central banks bailing out commercial financial institutions. With another financial crisis coming and global growth still struggling to gain momentum, how can we prepare for this next crisis? Robert Alibur, author of the 7th edition of Manias, Panics and Crashes, the financial Bible for many, joins me in studio. So if it's not going to be corporate but sovereign debt that fuels this next crisis, why don't we see enough central banks putting more pressure on governments?
Because it's still too early. The next crisis is going to occur in China, is occurring in China. Property prices are declining, and they're going to decline for the next 8 to 10 years, much as they did in Japan in the 1990s. Many of the state-owned enterprises in China will have to have their debts, their loans to the Chinese banks, reorganized. Their indebtedness is much too large relative to their sales.
This isn't just going to be private spending for themselves. The government is very much going to intervene on their behalf.
The government will intervene. Many of the local governments in China have established firms that are property developers. You've heard of the 12 ghost cities in China. These ghost cities are essentially owned by the local governments. The lenders to these ghost cities, that is the major Chinese banks, are going to have to take large haircuts on their loans to these property developers owned by the local governments, and the lenders, the large Chinese banks, are going to have to be bailed out by the People's Bank of China and by the government. And so the too big to fail doctrine applies in Beijing and Shanghai, just as it does in New York and London.
I mean, essentially every market is exposed to China. So what are we going to see in terms of knock-on effects?
Well, the biggest knock-on effect that we're already seeing is that the prices of raw materials, of iron ore, of coal, of petroleum, of copper, have fallen very sharply. This has had a major impact on Canada. The price of the Canadian dollar has fallen by 20% in terms of the US dollar. Similarly, the price of the Australian dollar has fallen. Brazil is having a very hard time. Brazil had a glorious 8 to 10 years as the Chinese economy was expanding, and now as the growth in China slows, the price of the Brazilian currency has fallen sharply, and Brazil is entering 4 or 5 years of very hard times.
The larger impact seems to be diminished by the immediate needs, right? So as governments are confronted by this crisis, what financial tools do they have other than printing money?
That's their major financial tool. The Chinese are very bright, very imaginative, very experimental, very pragmatic, and so they will try 1,000 things to keep the economy growing at 5, 6, or 7% a year. But as household wealth declines in China, and that is inevitable as property prices decline, Chinese households are going to reduce their spending. So we're already seeing a massive increase in the excess supply of automobiles in China. The automobile producers have made many more cars than Chinese consumers want to buy. And this is especially true at the upscale end of the Chinese market.
Let's be really speculative, okay? Let's talk about which country, region, market is going to fall first as the Chinese real estate sector begins its slow descent.
Perhaps the country that has been most dramatically affected has been Brazil, in part because the sharp decline in the prices of commodities has occurred at the same time as there is a political crisis in Brazil about the legitimacy of some of the government financial transactions in the last 3 or 4 years. So Brazil is clearly going to be much more affected than Canada, than Chile, than Australia, other producers.
Even Venezuela?
Venezuela is a basket case. It has a corrupt government. It has been adversely affected by the sharp decline in the price of petroleum, and the government is flailing out trying to find a villain so that it can stay in power.
Is it presumptuous to even begin thinking about what the rebound is going to look like?
I'll be back here for another interview with you before that occurs.
All right, thank you.